I recently found myself learning 3 different pieces of music at the same time that all required passing the accompaniment between the hands. And whilst none of them was particularly difficult from a technical point of view, I was finding that they seemed to take me an inordinate amount of time to learn. So I thought it would be interesting to share with you what I discovered as I was looking for strategies to help me deal with this. Are you sitting comfortably? Then let's begin. Hi, this is Tommy with Tommy's Piano Corner, the place for returning pianists or indeed anybody who loves piano to share tips and ideas of how to get the best from this great hobby. If it is your first trip here, then please do think about subscribing. Simply hit the little icon in the bottom right hand corner of your screen now and it's all done for you. In the majority of the pieces we play, our hands have a defined role, don't they? So think about, say, Chopin's E-flat Nocturne. The right hand plays the melody, the left hand plays the accompaniment. In the slow movement of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, the left hand plays the bass, the right hand plays an accompaniment plus the melody. And you'll find many other situations perhaps where the left hand takes the melody and the right hand takes the rest. And other places where, okay, the hands do share the job of the accompaniment a little bit between them, but in fairly defined ways. All in these cases, I don't find it too difficult to get my head around what it is I need to play. However, there are a number of pieces, and this is particularly I find true of transcriptions, where the accompaniment has been distributed between the hands, quite often for ergonomic reasons. However, that said, it's crucial when we play that you can't tell which hand is playing what, otherwise it would just sound wrong. As I say, I found myself practicing 3 pieces, so Mendelssohn's Song Without Words number 4, the Alkan transcription of Bach Siciliano, and the melody by Gluck. And again, all of these, I say, are not particularly tricky, but they were taking me a long time to learn. Now, I'm not saying I found a silver bullet that fixes this, clearly I haven't, but I did find a few things that do help make the learning process that little bit faster, and that's what I'd like to share now. Perhaps my first tip here would be to think about actually consciously memorizing this kind of piece. Now, I'm not necessarily a great believer that you have to memorize every piece of music that you learn, I certainly don't. But I think with the additional complication of splitting things between the hands here, it actually helps to commit this to memory fairly quickly so that we've got one less thing to think about whilst we're playing it. The next thing then to think about is how we're going to split things between our hands. And if you look, say, at the Siciliano, for example, it looks like Alkan has split this in almost a random manner between the hands. And maybe this is purely to help the notation or simply because that's how it suited his hands. And this is where my next tip comes really, and that is that, you know, we're under no obligation most of the time to follow the way something seems to be split just because of the way it's written. Now, clearly, there are pieces of music where the composer splits something between the hands for a particular reason, and here we should follow what's being requested. You know, I'll give, maybe this is obviously an advanced example, but if you listen to Rachmaninoff's Rhapsody on a Theme of Paganini, in one of the variations, there's basically a scale that he splits between the hands. And if you listen to this, it sounds very, very different than how it would ever sound if it was played in one hand. Now, clearly, a master pianist could probably get the same effect using just one hand, but I'm fairly sure that pretty much all of them would just follow Rachmaninoff's notation. However, in pieces of music like, say, the Song Without Words or the Siciliano, the key is that we don't want to know what's been split into what hand. So a good first step then is to start working through it section by section and deciding whether or not we want to follow the split that's been suggested by the composer or the transcriber. And If not, make our choices there and then. And in fact, what I did was I just put a highlighter mark in sort of pink or yellow on any note where I intend to play it with a different hand than it appears to be written for. And whilst we're doing this, I highly recommend writing the fingering that we've chosen. And this is a mistake I made a few times, that I didn't bother writing the fingering in because I thought, oh yes, I'll remember it tomorrow. Tomorrow I sit down and can't remember which fingering I use, so I'm either spending time working it out a second time, or indeed quite often choosing a completely different fingering and then needing to practice a separate set of fingering, which is not a great idea. I find that these first two strategies work pretty well for pretty much any kind of piece, and certainly all of the three pieces I've mentioned here. The trick though is to just go nice and slowly. You don't need to rush through this process, and you'll save yourself lots of time later by doing this groundwork. The next strategy I'd like to share is something I actually got from a Graham Fitch video, and he calls it strands separately. And he used it specifically as a way of practicing multi-voice pieces such as a Bach fugue, where you have maybe one of the voices that is split between the hands. So effectively, if we look at the Siciliano, we've got a bass note, we've got an arpeggiated pattern, and then we've got the melody. Now, that gives us effectively three voices. So the way we can start practicing this is to first practice just the bass and the arpeggio without the melody. And that's two strands, if you like, of the three strands that are there. And this gives us the advantage that it frees up some listening and thinking power to help us focus on the arpeggio. Now clearly, and this is why I said, we must start by working out how we're going to split it between our hands and how we're going to finger it. We want to make sure we use exactly the same fingering that we want to use in the finished product before we start practicing it. Now, as an acid test, I'd recommend that you record this stage as well, because you might be surprised, as I was, that there are quite often little bits of unevenness as one hand takes over from the other. Now, I practice this just in musically sensible phrases, so in this Siciliano that could be anything from 2 to 4 bars at a time, and practice it with and without pedal as well. The next tip that I found helpful was to take the bit that is split between the hands, and rather than playing it as legato notes as written, to actually play it staccato. And what I found is that this really does help both the brain and the fingers to isolate that particular part as being all one set of notes that belong together, rather than some notes played in one hand and some notes played in the other. Now again, I do this in musically sensible phrases, and I certainly wouldn't worry about trying to do it at maybe the intended tempo. Slowly, deliberately and surely is perfectly fine. Of the three pieces I mentioned here, this technique works also very well for the song without words, but I found it less helpful with the melody from Gluck, to be honest. However, I would advise avoid spending too much time practicing individual variants in isolation. What I found the best way to do was to practice all variants together. So practice the strands separately, practice the staccato accompaniment, practice the as written, practice with pedal, practice without pedal. Equally, a good thing to do is to work in, as I say, small phrases. But let's say if you're going to practice this piece for 20 minutes a day, work on each phrase for, say, 5 minutes. So in one day, you could do 4 phrases. And the next day, you move to the next set of phrases and you chain along in that way, so that you're sort of practicing something slightly different each day, but you're also reinforcing a lot of what you were working on the previous day. I also found it actually helpful to use these variants even when you're not going to distribute part of the accompaniment. Now, if you do come across the odd phrase that you find just really doesn't want to sink in, and whatever you do, it seems to go wrong, the best way I found of fixing it was to work on it by basically adding a note at a time. So start with the minimum bit that you can play reliably right, then add a note to that. Practice that for a while, then add another note. Practice that for a while, then add another note. And that way you'll build the phrase up nice and slowly. And if it takes 10 minutes, 15 minutes, so what? You know, that it takes the time it takes, but it will probably get you there far faster than stumbling through it each time and getting it wrong. Now, for the melody by Gluck, one of the most useful things I found was looking for patterns within the music. And clearly, before we do this, we also need to make sure we work out how we want to split it between the hands. Now, there's a very interesting video of Yuja Wang playing this, and from what I can see of her hands, given the camera angle, it looks like she takes pretty much all of the accompaniment in her left hand and doesn't bother to distribute it as the score would suggest that you might want to. But then there are many videos of other pianists who treat it very, very differently. Now, I used a fairly simple rule of thumb when I worked out how to split it for myself. And basically what I did was, if the accompaniment note marked in the treble clef, so to be played with the right hand, is actually an octave or less below the melody note, then I do play it with my right hand. However, if it's more than an octave, then more often than not, I've just opted to take the entire bit with my left hand. In terms of patterns, there are a few of them, but there are two very clear ones. The accompaniment is eighth notes, as you can see, and constructed as a mixture of two-note chords, or dyads if you prefer, and sometimes single notes. Looking at just the opening bars, the eighth note pattern in groups of four is one dyad, a single note, then two more dyads. Also, we have an interesting fact that the single note is also the same as the top note of the third pair. This same pattern holds true for measures 1, 3 and 4. Measure 2, of course, having a different pattern that we'll come back to. However, if we look really closely in bar 5, the pattern is subtly different in that each of the 4 sets of notes is a dyad. However, and very interestingly, the pattern of the top note of the second and third pairs of notes being the same remains. The way this is notated, we can see that Scambati suggests we split the second dyad between the hands, yet take the third and fourth dyads in the left hand alone. What I found for myself was that at first this makes it slightly more tricky to read, but once we've recognized this different pattern, it actually makes it easier for us to remember what we need to play. And just to sort of visually help myself, I noted a pink dot where you've got a single note in the second part of the eighth note, and then I put a yellow line where there was a two-note chord. Another pattern that I found helpful to recognize was where the interval was a sixth for that second or third set of notes rather than a third or a fourth. Because in these cases, I always opt to play the bottom note of that interval with my fourth finger and the top note with my thumb. And that therefore means that it helps me remember which fingering position I want to adopt when I see that particular pattern of notes. It also means that I can easily then reach the bottom note with my pinky without needing to stretch, as this is generally an octave below the top. One of the most useful things I found when practicing this was to spend plenty of time looking at the score. So back to that Liszt quotation I've mentioned before, think 10 times and play once. So what I mean by this is, rather than just sitting down and starting to play straight away, look at the pattern again carefully. Look at how you've marked it up if you've used this idea of dots in the way I did to notice where there's a single note or where there's a two-note chord. Find the top note of the middle two chords. Remind yourself where it is. Once you've done all of this, then practice the small segment that you've learned at. And I would do, small musically sensible segments, 3, 4, 5 bars at a time. The reason I stress this is because I don't know about you, but I'm one of these people that thinks practicing the piano has to be about moving the fingers all the time and making some noise. Whereas in reality, there's just as much value quite often to be gained, if not more value to be gained, from stopping, looking and thinking. Of course, we can also practice this by using the idea of strands separately, so by omitting the melody if we like. And when we do add the melody back, let's not forget it's not just about getting the right notes, it's also about making sure we voice the melody at the same time. And again, for any individual practice session, I would avoid using too much material at a time, right? So keep it in fairly small segments that you can manage so that you spend enough time practicing them, but at the same time, we're not just repeating stuff endlessly to the point that in actual fact, our brains stop even focusing on what we're doing, because that really won't help us at all. My final tip then is to get yourself into a regular habit of recording your practice session for that piece. So the entire 10, 15, 20 minutes, whatever you spend per day on that piece. And whilst you're doing so, don't only use it to listen to the sound and make sure, of course, that everything sounds smooth and you can't tell how it's been split between your hands, but also watch your fingers very carefully and look for any of those tiny hesitations where it looks like the fingers can't quite remember which note to go for. I found, for me at least, that quite often in the moment, as it were, when you're trying to add expression, I get these little hesitations of which notes to play. And it's good to see where they are so you can work on getting rid of them. I hope you'll find these tips useful if you're tackling this kind of music at the moment. If you're not already, then please do subscribe to Tommy's Piano Corner. Don't forget to hit the little bell icon so that you're notified of new videos as and when they're released. I do thank you very much for watching today and look forward to seeing you very soon.